Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces, including family. Family tends not to come out for many events that I do anyway. And it's just good to see them. And also so many good friends. Thank you all for coming. How many of you actually have started reading or beginning to enjoy Hillary Jordan's Mudbound? Great, great, great. So what I'm going to try and do is provide the setting for the book. And I'm not tech savvy, so got a technician right close to me here. And so what I want to do is try to provide a bit of a setting, and then we'll talk together. So I'll probably talk about 30 minutes, maybe not that much, and then I will allow you to talk to me. I just realized that I need a book, so let me grab the book and then I'll be right back. Had to have all my equipment with me before I get started. So again, the title is Race, Resistance, and Power in Post-World War II Mississippi. And when I talked to Christine Reeder, she wanted a historian to sort of provide the setting for Mississippi. And it's really interesting that Hillary Jordan chose Mississippi because it is a highly contested terrain, if you know what I mean. So let me give you a little bit of background, and then we'll talk together. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you. So as you hear possible topics that I mention, this is just going to be brief. Please jot them down, and then we can talk together about them, okay? Assuming that I can answer your question, or at least we can kind of figure out what's going on. So during and immediately after the Second World War, many Americans were still experiencing economic depression, especially in the rural South. They didn't have the cars, the radios, the refrigerators, the telephones, and other conveniences that quickly had become conveniences for Americans living in cities and towns. As Laura in Hillary Jordan's book Mudbound shows, many rural women were still washing clothes by hand without even the convenience of indoor plumbing. African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other racial and ethnic minorities were particularly hit hard by the Depression. Already at the bottom of the socioeconomic status, large numbers of African Americans in the rural South were still trying to eke out a living off the land as sharecroppers. Ann Moody, in her book Coming of Age in Mississippi, describes her first childhood home in rural Mississippi. I'm still haunted by the dreams of the time we lived on Mr. Carter's plantation, she wrote. Lots of Negroes lived on his place. Like Mama and Daddy, we were all farmers. We all lived in a rotten wood two-room shack, but Mama and Daddy did what they could to make it livable. Since we had only one big room and a kitchen, we all slept in the same room. It was like 3 rooms in one. Mom and them slept one quarter of the room. I had my little bed in another corner next to one of the big wooden windows. Around the fireplace, a rocking chair and a couple of straight chairs formed a sitting area. This big room had plain, dull-colored wallpaper tacked loosely to the walls with large thumbtacks. Under each tack was a piece of cardboard, which had been taken from shoe boxes and cut into little squares to hold the paper and keep the tacks from tearing through. Because there were not enough tacks, the paper bulged in places. The kitchen didn't have any wallpaper, and the only furniture in it was a wood stove, an old table, and a safe. And actually, in Ann Moody's story, as you read the autobiography, there were 3 children who actually were born and then grew up partly for a short while in this 2-room shack. So all of the children ended up in one corner of the space in Mississippi. So as a child, Ann Moody and other children in her situation seemingly had no way out of persistent poverty, legal inequalities, and outright terrorism. If anyone challenged the Southern states' system of segregation, sanctioned by the Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision, their lives and those of their family and community were in jeopardy. And yet, Mississippi in the World War II era, and especially after, was even more a contested terrain than it had been before the war. Many African Americans, whether north, south, east, or west, rural or urban, were slowly but steadily undermining segregation laws and policies, doing this throughout the country before, during, and immediately after the war. So in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, large numbers of African Americans had left the rural South for southern, western, and northern urban centers seeking jobs, access to education, and better living conditions. And if you look on the map, you can see where they went. And there's a wonderful book out by Isabel Wilkerson.
Yes.
What's the name of it?
This is The Warmth of Other Suns.
It's wonderful. The Warmth of Other Suns. Strongly encourage you to read that book. And so you get a sense of where actually, I don't know if you can see in the back there, it's a pretty light projector. You can get a sense of where African Americans went, all the way to Oxnard, California, Los Angeles, and so on. They fled poverty, disfranchisement, and white terrorism manifested at its most extreme form, as Hillary Jordan has shown us, in the lynching of mostly men and boys. The northern and western urban centers to which African Americans fled enabled black migrant men and later women to vote and participate in the nation's political process. Their right, of course, according to the 15th Amendment that had been passed in 1869. So as early as 1928, Chicago's South Side voters were represented by black Congressman Oscar DePriest. In the 1930s and 40s, there were black state legislators in the West, in the Midwest, East, and even a few in the Upper South. Confined to certain parts of the cities and towns because of racism, African Americans turned segregation into community, and I'll repeat that. You can tell I'm a college professor. African Americans turned segregation into community, and community into political advantage by challenging subordinate black status. So it's almost as if it was a deftly planned strategy. Migration would bring about the political base necessary for attacking the injustices of the post-Reconstruction legislation in the South and elsewhere. So African Americans in all parts of the country consistently condemned political, economic, and social repression in their newspapers, in their books, in sermons, in magazines, and so on. And then as legislatures in local, state, and national arenas, they were able to chip away at segregation laws and policies. President Roosevelt, recognizing the rising political influence of the black vote and organizing activities among black scholars, labor organizations, and others who were engaged in finding solutions to persistent inequities, formed what was called the Black Cabinet. This advisory group focused on issues relevant to African Americans. Roosevelt was different than other presidents, many African Americans believed. He seemed to view African Americans as part of the nation's society, as part of American society. So, by the 1930s, most African American voters had become Democrats. It wasn't easy to vote the Democratic ticket because, of course, Dixiecrats were still very much a part of the Democratic ticket. I can remember my own grandfather having a real problem much later thinking about voting Democratic. Not easy. In early 1941, as the country was mobilizing for war, it became evident to African Americans that despite their protest, national policy would continue to support racial discrimination in the new defense jobs, in the military, and in the industries that had large government contracts. The government had ignored a 7-point program presented by A. Philip Randolph, Walter White, who was part of the NAACP. Randolph was president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids, a labor organization, who had outlined minimum essentials in giving African Americans just consideration in the defense program. As wages skyrocketed at these plants holding large defense contracts and no change in the rigid anti-black policy in industry, Randolph developed a program to force change. He proposed a march on Washington. Of what he said, 50 to 100,000 African Americans would descend on Washington in March, demanding jobs in defense industries. Almost immediately, the plan spread like wildfire in the black communities, causing alarm, as you might imagine, among high government officials. By June of 1941, many thousands, if not 100,000, African Americans were making preparations to travel to the nation's capital for the march. The march was scheduled to begin July 1. In the last 3 weeks of June, public officials, including Eleanor Roosevelt and some prominent African Americans, desperately tried to persuade Randolph to call off the march. After all, what would the march do to the nation's image in a time of imminent war? Randolph was adamant. The threat of exposure was, of course, his best advantage, the best leverage. President Roosevelt, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and Randolph met. Neither moved. Nothing changed. Finally, as the time drew near, Roosevelt called Randolph in again. And he told him if he would call off the march, he would issue an order, quote, with teeth in it. This order would prohibit discrimination in employment in defense industries and in the government. On June 25th, the President issued Executive Order 8802 that provided for, quote, the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without regard to race, creed, national origin, or color. The government then established the Fair Employment Practices Committee to receive and investigate complaints of discrimination in violation of the order. While African Americans praised the order, some argued it was second only to the Emancipation Proclamation, white Southerners generally opposed it, and widespread discrimination continued in defiance of the FEPC. A Louisville newspaperman is an example of Southern intransigence, said that, quote, all the armies of the world, both of the United Nations and the Axis, could not force upon the South the abandonment of racial segregation. An Alabama lawyer organized a League to Maintain White Supremacy. That was the title of the organization, League to Maintain White Supremacy. And the Alabama governor declared that the policy of segregation was essential to racial peace. Thus, the United States entered the war in December 1941, calling upon allies to defend democracy, to be the arsenal of democracy, in which the international community would achieve freedom of speech, freedom to worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, while simultaneously holding fast to a pattern of discrimination that was upheld in almost all of the nation's institutions. But even so, Randolph, in a sense, won. The executive order and the FEPC activities were successful in many cases and eventually led to thousands of African Americans who would be employed in the defense industry. Persistent resistance had been and continued to be the weapon for change. So during World War II, African American men would eventually serve in segregated units with white officers in all branches of the military. This had been true, of course, in the Civil War, Spanish-American War, the First World War. Interestingly, in the Revolutionary War, there were only a few, maybe 2 or 3, separate black units. Both on and off the base, however, soldiers were subjected to absolute savagery. There's no other word for it. Many losing their lives in uniform. And we need to talk about the meaning of the uniform. So please jot that down as one of your questions. The black press consistently exposed racial discrimination in the military and exposed white mob terrorism on and off the bases against black soldiers. The black press and the others called for a double V victory. Oh, let me just stop here. I found this and I thought you might be interested, those of you who know Charles White, who's a Pasadena artist. This was his depiction of, it's not sort of showing very well here, but it's this depiction of African American soldiers coming home from the war, just coming on furlough and being attacked by white mobs. The press and others called for a double V victory. Victory overseas and victory at home. Victory over racial discrimination. The black press reports of white mob activity and lynching were so threatening to black soldiers' morale, white officers believed, that they banned black newspapers from the bases or had them burned if they found them. Discrimination, segregation, and subjugation persisted in the military and throughout the nation. Riots on and off the bases ensued as black soldiers fought back against white violence. What's particularly telling is that the U.S. attitude about German POWs. They were often treated better than African American soldiers in the South and outside the South. They could go into places that African Americans could not. Mississippi had at least 25 German POW camps. I think it was really close to 50, but I couldn't get the exact number. There was also one in Greenville, which is where much of the story is situated in Mudbound. So in her novel, Hilary Jordan placed her character, Ronzel, in the 761st Battalion. It was an actual tank battalion that was considered one of the most outstanding fighting units. It fought at the Battle of the Bulge and saw service in 6 European countries. Although 4 major generals and the Undersecretary of War commended the battalion for its gallant service, the unit was repeatedly denied the prestigious Distinguished Unit Citation until 1978, when President Jimmy Carter presented it. Eventually, about 1 million African Americans actually served, men and women actually served in the armed services, including 4,000 women in the Women's Army Corps. This, of course, is not the Women's Army Corps, but I just like this photograph. I think it's tremendous. Former Army veteran Medgar Evers became a symbol of black American resistance throughout the state of Mississippi in the post-World War II era. Evers dropped out of high school, a high school in Decatur, Mississippi, a little sawmill town in the center part of the state. He dropped out to enlist, serving in France and England with the Red Ball Express, a transportation unit. His time in the service made him less tolerant of the Mississippi way of life. In fact, he considered not returning to the state at all. But when he did return in 1946, he, his brother Charles, also a veteran, and 3 other veterans decided they would register to vote. And they were successful. They registered to vote. The first black Americans probably to do so in Decatur since Reconstruction. The Evers brothers' parents were warned repeatedly, first by whites and then black messengers, to keep the young men from voting. They had registered successfully, but had not yet voted. Medgar and the other 4 men marched to the courthouse to vote. Upon entering, they found around 20 armed men, angry white men, some of whom the Evers boys had played with as children. Needless to say, the men did not vote that day. But that the Evers brothers would even consider voting came not only because, like so many other veterans, they simply were not going to tolerate second-class citizenship any longer, but also because, as Charles Payne argues in his book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, The Organizing Tradition and the Mississippi Freedom Struggle, the brothers were in keeping with the family and community tradition of resistance. They were a farm family, poor but not destitute, Medgar used to say, a very religious family, and a family that thought of itself as heirs of a fighting tradition. Medgar's great-grandfather, grandfather, and father consistently resisted, risking their lives by fighting back literally and engaging, like so many African Americans, in day-to-day resistance, such as refusing to step off the sidewalk when a white person approached, or looking a white person directly in the eye. All dangerous activities for an African American in the South. And Decatur, located in the central part of Mississippi, was a violent place, especially violent place for blacks. What's interesting is that the Delta has many more African Americans, and so there was, some degree of comfort in the fact that there were more African Americans. But as you went to the center of the state, and especially in the Southwest where Ann Moody lived, it was even much more dangerous. So Decatur was this violent place. A popular Saturday activity for young white men in Decatur, Mississippi, was to ride around town looking for a Negro to run down in their cars. Evers was 11 or 12 when a close family friend was lynched. He was beaten to death at the local fairgrounds because he, quote, sassed a white woman. The young man's blood-stained clothes were left on a fence for over a year as a reminder to Negroes. Small wonder that Evers considered not returning to his hometown. Mississippi was a terrorist state for African Americans then and certainly earlier. Ann Moody's autobiographical account of her experience in Mississippi in the early 1950s is just one of many examples of how white Southerners continued to terrorize African Americans to maintain white supremacy. So let me just read a little bit. I strongly recommend Ann Moody's book, Coming of Age in Mississippi. I have my students read it every year. I think it's really an important book for all Americans to read. And it shows you how close Hillary Jordan was actually to the truth here. So, one night about 1 o'clock, I was awakened by what I thought was a terrible nightmare. It was an empty dream that consisted only of hollering and screaming voices. It seemed as though I was in an empty valley screaming, and the sounds of my voice were reflected in a million echoes that were so loud I was being lifted in midair by the sound waves. I found myself standing, trembling in the middle of the floor, reaching for the light string. Then I saw Mama running to the kitchen in her nightgown. "Mama, Mama, what's all them voices? Where are all those people? What's happening?" "I don't know," she said. "Listen, listen," I said, almost screaming. So Moody and her mother and her stepfather decided to drive to where people were beginning to gather. When we turned the corner, leaving the quarters, Raymond drove slowly alongside hundreds of people running down the road. They were all headed in the direction of the blaze that reddened the sky. The crowd of people began to swell until driving was utterly impossible. Finally, the long line of cars stopped. We were about 2 blocks away from the burning house now. The air was so hot that water was running down the faces of the people who ran past the car. The burning house was on the rock road leading to the school, adjacent to the street we stopped on. So we couldn't tell which house it was. From where we sat, it seemed as though it could have been 2 or 3 of them burning. I knew every Negro living in the houses that lined that rock road. I passed them every day on my way to and from school. I sat there in my pajamas wishing I had thrown on a dress or something so that I could get out of the car. And so the stepfather begins asking people who are passing what's going on. Excuse me, Raymond, stepfather, leaned out of the car and spoke to a Negro man. Do you know whose house is on fire? I heard it was the Taplin family. They say the whole family is still in the house. Looked like they are done for, so they say. Didn't any of us say anything after that? We just sat in the car silently. I couldn't believe what the men had just said. A whole family burned to death. Impossible, I thought. Soon people started walking back down the road. The screams and hollering had stopped. People were almost whispering now. They were all Negroes, although I was almost sure I'd seen some white pass before. I guess not, I thought, sitting there sick inside. Some of the ladies passing the car had tears running down their faces as they whispered to each other. Didn't you smell that gasoline? I heard a lady who lived in the quarters say. That house didn't just catch fire. And just think, those, expletive, burned up a whole family, another lady said. Then they were quiet again. Hey, Jones, Raymond said to one of the men, how many was killed? About 8 or 9 of them, Ray. They say the old lady and one of the children got out. I didn't see her nowhere, though. You think the house was set on fire? Sure, it sure looks like it, Ray. It burned down like nothing. When I got there, that house was burning on every side. If it had started on the inside of the house at some one place, then it wouldn't burn down like it did. All the walls fell in together. Too many strange things are happening around here these days. Now most of the people in cars were gone. Ray drove up the Little Rock Road and parked. I almost vomited when I caught a whiff of the odor of burned bodies mixed with the gasoline. The wooden frame house had been burned to ashes. All that was left were some iron bedposts and springs, a blackened refrigerator, a stove, and some kitchen equipment. We sat in the car for about an hour, silently looking at this debris and the ashes that covered the 9 charcoal-burned bodies. 100 or more so also stood around. Negroes from the neighborhood in their pajamas, nightgowns, and housecoats, and even a few whites, with their eyes fixed on that dreadful scene. I shall never forget the expression on the faces of the Negroes. There was almost unanimous hopelessness in them. The GI Bill made it possible for Medgar Evers to attend Alcorn College, a black college in Mississippi. While in college, he met and married Merle Beasley of Vicksburg and began assuming leadership positions in several campus organizations. At the same time, Medgar began imagining his home state without racism. He actually loved Mississippi. He loved the landscape, the hunting, the fishing, and the sense of community among African Americans. When Medgar and Merle moved to the Delta, where Hillary Jordan situates her story, Medgar was struck by the poverty of the region. He was used to poverty, but he saw a kind of poverty heretofore he hadn't imagined. He saw children without shoes and proper clothing, adults with nothing to eat, and shacks without doors and windows. Having joined the NAACP before college, though he had never heard of it when he tried to register to vote, Evers increased his involvement in 1952. At that time, he began organizing NAACP chapters among the small farmers and sharecroppers of the Delta. Evers searched for a strategy that would bring about change, a change that truly transformed the lives of African Americans, a transformation that ensured them equal access to jobs, housing, schools, and the ability to live without fear of white mobs. He was impressed, according to his wife, with rebellions occurring against African colonialism, especially that of the Mau Mau in Kenya. enough so that he thought long and hard about the idea of African Americans engaging in guerrilla welfare in the Delta. Not because he had any hope of winning, but because he thought such a campaign might focus the attention of the rest of the country on the injustices of Mississippi. But it seems religious inclinations prevented him from thinking more deeply about guerrilla violence. Finally, Evers decided what he needed was a law degree. Mississippi needed more black lawyers. With the help of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund attorney Thurgood Marshall, Evers filed for an application at the University of Mississippi in 1954. While waiting for a response, his father was hospitalized, severely ill. There in the Decatur Hospital basement of the Negro ward, Evers' father lay dying, while a lynch mob gathered outside trying to get at a black youth who had been in a fight with a white man. Evers was furious that he and his father had to listen to the howls of a lynch mob as his father lay dying. It proved, he repeatedly told audiences later, that a black American in Mississippi could neither live nor die in peace if things remained the same. So after stalling for 9 months, the state finally rejected Evers' application to the University of Mississippi. Rejected it on technical grounds. University policy required 2 letters of recommendation from prominent citizens. Evers' letters, according to the rejection letter, were from citizens from his home county, not from the county in which he was then living. And just for good measure, the university changed its policy, announcing that now the 5 letters would be required only from alumni. The suit made Evers famous throughout Mississippi, and threats on his life increased from then on. Rather than push his case any further, which evidently Thurgood Marshall wanted to do, Evers then became field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, which of course eventually led to his assassination in June of 1963. So Medgar Evers is important for multiple reasons, but not only for understanding his contributions to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, but also because he reflects how African Americans in Mississippi and elsewhere, Pasadena, slowly but surely helped bring down legal and de facto segregation. Evers helped lay the groundwork for the student activists, mainly of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who would descend upon Mississippi in the 1960s to work with local community leaders in the establishment of freedom schools. And this is an example when they came in 1964, led by Bob Moses, if you recall, those of you who recall your history. And they engaged in voter registration drives. These students were then able to draw upon a tradition in Mississippi and other southern states in which resistance was manifested both openly and subtly by black individuals like Fannie Lou Hamer, my heroine, or Florence. Let's talk about Florence in Jordan's novel. Hamer and women like her, along with families and communities, helped maintain a culture of resistance that stretched back hundreds of years. They must be credited with instilling within their children and their children's children the belief that they were worthy of equality, dignity, and all the rights of American citizenship, actually promised in the 14th Amendment passed in 1868. The legislation of the 1950s and 60s that overturned post-Reconstruction laws could not have occurred without an African American culture of resistance. So Mississippi, in many ways, was the state for an author like Hillary Jordan to address America's racial past. It still, like so many other places in the United States, remains a highly contested terrain in which the past affects the present and one assumes will still affect the future. Thank you. So we'll leave, can you hear me? Good. So we'll leave Fannie Lou Hamer up there because I think she's terrific, and I hope you'll get acquainted with her. And I'm willing to take any questions you might have, based on the novel or just anything that I might have said.
You said to note uniform, what the meaning of the uniform.
Right. Yeah, let's talk about the uniform. Why were African American men being attacked because they were in uniform? What's going on there, do you think?
Could you use the microphone?
Oh, sorry. You can't hear me? Okay. So the question has to do with the uniform, which I suggested you might ask me. So why do you think African American men were especially being attacked because they were in uniform? What does the uniform symbolize in American society? Yes, Bill?
Symbolized that they were Americans, and the whites of Mississippi resented that.
Right.
Because they were considered to be less than qualified to be citizens.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it, very much. Symbolized, you know, they're American too, equal maybe with whites. Yeah.
Respect.
Respect, yeah, the uniform.
Due respect.
Due respect, it's the uniform after all. After all, yeah, true.
Authority,
And authority.
and possibly the fact that they would carry on. I mean, it would be a very frightening thought, probably, to a white Mississippian, the whole notion of this person having that kind of power at some place at some time.
Right, yeah. You
I'd say something like that, because if a militarized black population, how that'd be threatening to the control of white
Right.
population in the Mississippi.
Yeah, there's also a way in which we can provide a kind of gender analysis to this. What does it mean for a man to wear a uniform? It sort of helps define masculinity, right? And so when an African American man wears a uniform, it suggests that he is a man. And in the South, black men were called boys, even if they were 70 years old. So it's challenging the whole notion of white manhood, because white manhood was so dependent upon the notion that black men were not men. And so wearing that uniform is that symbol. You know, you go to war to become a man. Isn't that what the Marines said? Yeah. What's the slogan? I can't remember. Yeah. And so when black men go to war, then it also suggests there's a kind of entitlement to what all men should have, this American citizenship, going back to. Right, thank you. Other questions, comments?
Someone told me that it was about 2 years ago in New Albany, Mississippi, that there was a Ku Klux Klan meeting in broad daylight, and the sheriffs from the town were there to maintain order if need be. Do you think that sort of thing was on?
Continues that in New Albany, Mississippi, there was a Ku Klux Klan meeting, and the sheriffs were in the daytime, and the sheriffs were there to maintain order. And the question is, do I think that's still going on today? Absolutely. There is a license plate, right, that has been proposed by members of the Klan for the state of Mississippi, and it's going to be, what, KKK something else. And the governor, who thinks he might run for president, has not intervened at all, not even, has no opinion on it. He said it is not state business. Yeah. So, oh yeah, very much. This is Mississippi.
Well, hasn't the Ku Klux Klan demanded that it was First Amendment rights that they had?
Yes, the Ku Klux Klan has, and the ACLU has actually protected their First Amendment rights to march and so on. Absolutely, yes. Yes, a group, an organization that they probably, would not accept, except when they get their support, yeah. There was a hand over here.
Yeah, you mentioned both like on and off-base violence.
Yes.
I've heard of off-base violence. Can you speak a little more about on-base?
Right. Well, soldiers were often attacked by other soldiers, by white soldiers. Often there were times when black soldiers would try and enter into a space that was restricted to whites, and then they would get into a fight. So there was that, yeah. And this is all over the country. What's interesting is that most of the bases are located in the South. My own uncle, I grew up in Idaho, and my uncle grew up in Idaho too, but he lived in Salt Lake City, had never really experienced the South, and he was drafted and ended up in Texas. And talk about a rude awakening. Yeah. Terry?
I had a rude awakening too. I did basic training in South Carolina. But even more so before that, during the Second World War, scored by so many memories when we went that, I went south for the first time with my father's older sister. And I saw one of these prisoner of war camps. I've never seen cotton before. And there was barbed wire fence. And there were German soldiers with POW written on the backs of their jumpsuits, lying on their behinds, and blacks were picking cotton. And my father was fighting in Okinawa, and my uncles in Italy and Germany to preserve this democracy. And I've carried that with me all my life. I mean,
That's an image you can never forget.
it was around 1942.
Yeah, wow, thank you. I'm going to use that in my classes. Yeah. And that's an image you can never forget. And these are the enemy. This is the enemy. And all the posters are telling you who the enemy is. But yet, race trumps everything, right?
Do you know anything about Pasadena at this period of time, right after World War II?
Anything about Pasadena, what was going on in Pasadena? Race relations in Pasadena, highly segregated. Highly segregated. The pools were drained when after African Americans, all racial and ethnic minorities had one day to swim, I understand. Was that Thursday? Then the pools were drained. Was it Friday?
My daughter's doing something.
Is she doing research on that?
She's writing a book.
Good. I want to talk to her. So it was Friday. And so one day was restricted to Japanese Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and they had that day to swim, and then the pool was drained. This is the Rose Bowl. It's a public pool. Everybody's paying their taxes. And then the pool was drained, and then then whites had the rest of the week to swim. Yeah, segregation, very much. I remember when I moved here in the 80s, and I lived on San Pasqual, and friends, African American friends, came to visit, and they said, "We didn't know black people lived this far down." I said, "What?" I didn't know, what was going on here, because I was new. But evidently, segregation was pretty entrenched.
Racism did quite well in California.
Racism did quite well in California.
I myself, I take a little problem trying to live in an apartment in Monrovia.
In Monrovia.
60, and it turned out to be a legal battle that won in the courts of California. In the District Court of Appeal. The case is still cited in California law.
What is the case?
It's a case of the Abstract Investment Company versus Hutchinson.
Ah, Abstract Investment Company versus Hutchison. Did you all hear back there?
It was the first constitutional offense against an unlawful detainer, which was the mechanism by which they finally tried to get people moved from the apartment moved into. They did not, as a black person out of context, they thought it was something else. They rented to me, and then after discovering that I was black,
You had some relatives who weren't,
they
who revealed your...
process to try to get me out, but I wouldn't move.
So Dr. Hutchison had a problem getting into an apartment. He was accepted because they didn't realize that he was black. Once they realized he was black, this is in Pasadena, in Monrovia, they tried to get him out, and he refused to leave. So he went. How far did you go?
Went through the District Court of Appeals.
Through the District Court of Appeals, and you won your case.
I would have wanted them to appeal the decision made in the District Court of Appeal and try to get it into the United States Supreme Court. But the owners of the apartment building decided that they wouldn't take it any further, which upset me.
You wanted to go all the way to Supreme Court.
Yeah, well,
Why not? Yeah,
the case has been cited as case law before the United States Supreme Court because of the constitutional issue. The constitutional issue was that by evicting me from an apartment in California, they violated the right to equal protection of the law.
right. Your 14th Amendment. Yeah, right. Yeah. So what year was that?
I was in 1960. The case started out in 1960. It was finally adjudicated in 62.
1960 and 1962.
About that time was Proposition 14
Yes.
for the fair housing.
Well, it was the unmoved fair housing act and the lumber fair housing act. Those were cases in California legislation addressing housing discrimination. But the discrimination didn't have any teeth. I mean, the laws that they had didn't have any teeth. The only way to resolve the problem is to go to court and say, a decision in court.
Sure. You can't be right. Okay, so the case was finally resolved in 1962, but still continue to be a problem, right? Yes. Sure.
We're still feeling the results of the way Pasadena was segregated and what happened with it when Judge Manuel Real issued the order integrating the schools.
Mm-hmm.
Pasadena reacted the same way as Mississippi and Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
There was white flight that
Yeah.
ceased.
And Little Rock.
We have more private schools per capita than any other city, over 100,000.
Mm-hmm. And highly racially segregated, except for a few. Right, absolutely. So we're still seeing the results. I think we've answered your question, right? What about Pasadena? Very much. Yes, Ron?
What do you see as the psyche, political psyche, that would let Haley Barbour think he could run for president, given the history of his state and its present condition? Because I think we will find many of the same conditions in Delta if we begin to explore.
Even today?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as a southern psyche or political psyche that would allow him to think he will present himself as a candidate?
So the question is, what do I see?
As a scholar.
As a scholar, right. Oh, thanks, Ron. What is going on in the head of the governor of Mississippi, right?
And the country.
And the country, to allow him to think that he might be successful as a presidential candidate, given the history of Mississippi.
And the present statistics.
And the present stats on that. I think that there is a strong racial element in this country that's manifested in its attitude toward the current president of the United States. And I think that we cannot deny that race is playing a great role in the whole way in which Americans are responding to health care. I mean, it sort of moves beyond logic. And racial ideology is totally illogical. I mean, skin color doesn't really provide any sort of innate characteristics or qualities. Skin color, what does it matter? It's not, race is not biological. It's a system of beliefs that held onto very much and very useful for politicians.
You referred to its acronym, the NAACP.
Yes.
I wonder if you could just, I'm not sure everybody understands what that stands for, and maybe a little bit about
its origin.
Yeah.
The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Actually, it was established after a horrific riot in which many African Americans, even an 84-year-old man was lynched in Springfield, Illinois. W.B. Du Bois and Monroe Trotter, these are all activists in the late 19th, early 20th century, had formed a group called the Niagara Movement. They met at Niagara Falls in 1905. And so their platform was to demand the right for equality, the right to vote, because disfranchisement had occurred throughout the South, and demand equality in everything. And so when the riots occurred that lasted for over a week, military had to be called in Springfield, Illinois. And Springfield, Illinois is important because, of course, this was the home of Abraham Lincoln, and it was in the north. It woke the country up, or at least some in the country. So some white activists, including social workers and so on, decided to join with people like Du Bois and form an organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and actually was organized in 1910. And of course it still exists today and is still engaged in legal battles. And the Legal Defense Fund was helped form by Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, and helped to bring many of the cases that I hope we know about in the 1940s and 50s. They began with teacher salaries, just making teacher salaries equitable in the South. African American teachers were paid half of what white teachers were paid in the South.
I think it should be pointed out that by the early part of the 20th century and the post-Reconstruction era, racism really became much more of an issue, and that in part led to the starting of the NAACP, because black people were beginning to see that they needed to combine their efforts and fight this ogre that was being built around them. So there are a lot of organizations that were coming up.
There are multiple organizations. I'm not sure that racism is becoming an issue. Racism is pretty entrenched by the middle of the 19th century. It's pretty entrenched. Higher education institutions, Harvard, all sort of promoted the notion of racial inferiority and racial superiority. So it's pretty entrenched by 1850. It takes on a new spin with Darwinism, but still it's pretty much there. But you know, it helped to justify slavery and insubordinate black status and so on. It's just that African Americans who are moving north, and that's my point, increasingly are able to challenge, right? And so they form this organization with white allies and begin. But there are multiple organizations, even in fact, my book writes about this, even in the antebellum period among African Americans. Okay, is this one last question? One last question, yes.
I actually had two, because
Oh, okay.
I wrote down the name of the book on the black migration of blacks to the South, having been raised in Chicago. I was very aware of that kind of migration.
Absolutely.
But I didn't get the whole title of
The name of the book, Trudy, can you give it to us again? The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson.
That's correct. And then there's the other,
And that book is here in the library.
there was another book, The Promised Land, by Nicholas Lehman,
By Nicholas Lehman, right?
which is 1991.
And a colleague of mine, James Grossman, Land of Hope.
Yes.
Yeah, he writes about Chicago migration, absolutely. Yeah.
My other
Good.
question had to do with the statement you made that post-World War II, the South was basically democratic. Now we see the South as Republican. The establishment, I should say, in the South as being Republican.
Right. Or at least whites in the South are Republican.
What happened to make
That shift. Well, it really occurs with Nixon and then Reagan. And both, the Republican Party, you know, Barry Goldwater comes out against the Voting Rights Act. The Republican Party increasingly appeals to racism. And there's no other way to put it. You know, maybe you don't like what I'm saying, but there's no other way to put it. So when Nixon talks about going to bring law and order in 1968, he's using coded language. And he basically says very clearly that he's going to control blacks, you know, in various ways. Black people were, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, black people were rioting. Also, students were rioting. You all remember the Kent State situation. So Nixon was going to bring law and order, and what that said to many in the South was and he argued constantly for states' rights. Reagan, when he announces his candidacy, he announces it in Money, Mississippi. Now, who knows in this room the significance of Money, Mississippi? It's where 3 civil rights activists, 2 white and 1 black, were assassinated. Now, why would he choose Money, Mississippi? And he says that he is for states' rights. Again, that is coded language. White segregationists flock to the Republican Party. Trent Lott, many others.
Johnson they released his tapes, and when he signed the Civil Rights Act, he said they got it on tape, and this is about the end of the Democratic Party in the South.
When Johnson said that, absolutely, that's true. Yes, Johnson said, did you hear that? Right, okay. Yeah, Johnson said that when he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or the Voting Rights Act, one of those, one is 64, 165, that he said this is the end of the Democratic Party in the South. And of course he was right, or at least in the short term. There are a lot of black people in the South and a lot of black people migrating back to the South, so we'll stay tuned. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rita Roberts, for helping us understand post-World War II Mississippi and putting it into perspective for us with Hillary Jordan's book, I Found. I do hope that you will come in conversation with Jan Sanders on Saturday,